Today we have in our studio Mr. Rob Dolan from Amar International to talk about development programs, human rights issues, and health and education in conflict zones throughout the Middle East. Thanks, Rob, for being here with us. First, let's start off with Amar International and tell us about the organization and what you do.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. Amar International started in 1991 working with Iraqi refugees in the Iranian refugee camps. Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne went to the Iranian refugee camps to understand the humanitarian crisis that was happening in these camps. There was a great lack of medical facilities and a large amount of refugees that needed medical attention. Baroness Nicholson began to create primary healthcare clinics within these camps and continued to work with Iraqi refugees up until 2003 when Amar started working in Iraq proper post the US invasion. And started working with the Ministry of Health to create primary healthcare clinics, rebuild medical facilities within the country to ensure that communities had proper medical care. From that, Amar has grown into a organization with a U.S. presence that started in 2010, and we focus on healthcare, primary healthcare, mental health care, education, vocational training programs, human rights programs, and women empowerment programs.
So you get a lot of opportunity to see the devastation from conflict firsthand. So tell us about your role in Amar and some of the trips you've taken overseas.
Yeah, so as a program officer at Amar, I help to manage the programs that we run through the U.S. office, which focus on healthcare, education. As of recent, since the conflict with ISIS in the north, Amar has opened various primary healthcare clinics in the north, working in internally displaced persons camps.
Right.
Ensuring that doctors, nurses are available to work with populations that were fleeing ISIS, fleeing the violence that was happening within their communities, and ensuring that they have proper health care within UN-run IDP camps. I've been able, had the opportunity to go to these camps myself, see the facilities that we were able to build, through the wonderful support of our donors, and give the medical attention, the mental health care attention that is greatly needed.
So let's talk about some of the programs. How devastating is the impact of conflict on the economies of these communities?
Yeah, I mean, the impact that conflict has on local economies is absolutely devastating. It manifests in various forms, from food insecurity to a decrease in livelihoods, an increase of social pressure on, breadwinners to support their families, which then lead to greater social effects that happen within communities and on families, that kind of snowballs into a larger amount of effects.
So the impact of, say, electricity being shut off due to the conflict, or roads being shut down with security checkpoints, how does that really impact the families in these communities?
Yeah, so traders are not able to get supplies to markets. They're not able to sell goods. When people are forced to flee their homes, they lose their livelihoods altogether.
Right.
For example, in the Nineveh Plain in northern Iraq, many individuals are farmers. They had to flee into Kurdish regions of the country, and they lost their livelihoods. They have no income. They're not able to use the skills that they had developed their entire lives, that their families had for generations, and are living in cities where they're used to living in rural areas, and don't have an income and are really struggling to support their families.
Right. Let's talk about the psychological impact. So you said you had mental health programs. Are there a lot of, children and women and some of the elderly that are having, serious psychological problems because of the war?
Absolutely, and that's something that we, greatly came to our attention largely in the IDP camps in the north, particularly with Yazidi women that had been kidnapped by ISIS fighters, forced into sex slavery, experienced absolutely egregious human rights violations.
Right.
And many of them were coming to the camps once escaping, comatose, completely traumatized, unable to speak, or going into fits. And it really showed the massive gap in mental health care
Right.
in Iraq. Mental health care is something that as many countries continue to struggle with. We here in the U.S. continue to struggle with mental health issues, and getting adequate care to those that need that care. But in Iraq, there are few registered psychiatrists in the Kurdish region. In across the rest of the country, there aren't that many more. Psychology is not to the level that it really needs to be to meet the need for this. So we started a mental health care program to provide psychosocial support to these individuals that needed the care, and we then since expanded that out of the north to serve various populations that need mental health care.
Right. So a lot of times, people look at soldiers and the fighters actually having post-traumatic stress disorder, but we're finding out that it affects the entire communities that are in these conflict zones.
Yeah, absolutely. And PTSD is definitely something that we tried to focus on in our mental health care program, training doctors on how to identify signs of PTSD and how to create comprehensive treatment plans for these individuals. But many times it's hard to identify the intricacies of these issues, and a couple of months training for general practitioners isn't necessarily adequate enough. The program tried to approach it as best as possible, but this is something that definitely takes years and years of training and experience.
Right. So let's talk about education programs. What do you do to support education in these problem areas?
Yep. So Amar, we have two levels of education programs: primary, secondary education. So we most recently opened a school down in Basra that it's a charitable model. So a majority of the children pay tuition into this school, and then 10% is reserved for orphans and kids within the community. So that's primary and secondary school. We also then have education programs for youth and adults, mainly focused on vocational training programs. So providing computer classes, English courses, and then vocational training courses to help increase their chance of gaining a livelihood.
Right. Are there different challenges that, say, women face than men face in these communities?
Absolutely. And within the region, women continue to struggle on the livelihoods aspect, or being able to generate income for their family. When we particularly talk about families that men have been kidnapped, killed, or are traumatized from the war, a lot of the times the responsibility will fall on a female member of the house, and if that's something that she had not had to have skills on before, increasing and focusing on having women increase their skills and their ability to work definitely alleviates a lot of the pressure. But then they're also forced with the situation of that social pressure from their community or the family to go out and find a job, and if that's culturally appropriate or not.
Right.
So many women will try to identify jobs that they can do within their homes, that they can still watch their kids, they can still take care of their family, and gain an income within their homes. Another large issue that women particularly face within conflict zones is sexual violence. And this is something that our founder, Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne, has largely focused on, as her position as a peer in the House of Lords, focused on the issue of sexual violence in conflict. Women, disproportionately are affected by sexual violence, used as a tool, of violence, of torture within conflict zones, and ensuring that there are protections in place in many countries to try and avoid conflict directed at women is something that we focus on greatly.
Right. And so a lot of these women are facing those kinds of vulnerabilities on the battlefield, and then afterwards find themselves responsible for families because maybe the male head of household was killed or was drafted or is gone. And so they have almost a double burden. So what specific programs do you have that support women, trying to find another job or to help them support or raise their families independently?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have the New Iraq program is based in the south, in Basra and Tikar, funded by the U.S. consulate there. And this program identified widows of fighters that were fighting against ISIS that were then forced into positions of being breadwinners within their home. Right. So that could be a widow of a fighter, the daughter, the sister of. And this program paired these women with local mentors and with U.S. mentors. And the goal of the project was to create a network of women that helped them identify job opportunities, taught them soft skills in creating their own business, developing a business plan, writing a budget, so that they can then go on to apply for small grants to start their own businesses, whether that be within their home. Some individuals have started cooking co-ops within their home where a couple of the women will come together and start a catering company or a wedding planning company. And the improvement that we've seen in these women from the start of this project to the end is absolutely amazing. Some of the women, particularly from the Dikar region of Muthana Governorate, many of them expressed that they hadn't left really the house to socialize in quite some time, and this was an opportunity to get them out, meeting others in their community, socializing, and so many of them have talked about the great amount of confidence that they've gained throughout this program. Just knowing that they are able to now write a business plan or put together some kind of budget, and the improvement of these women have been great.
So, what about orphans? How large is the problem, and then what can we do about it?
Yeah, so in Iraq and throughout the region, the term orphan is usually defined as the loss of one parent, usually the father. So orphans could be have a mother, but not necessarily a father, and considered orphans. And a lot of times, there is a family structure there to support those children. But then other times, they're children that have lost both parents. Right. And it's something that we have tried to address in our schools, in our charitable model of ensuring that these children have the opportunity to a great education, that the loss of a parent due to conflict will not affect them long term, and that they will still have a greater opportunity of education and prosperity.
Right. Okay, so when these communities are devastated by conflict and their economies are disrupted, the essential services from the government's disrupted, their schools are destroyed or they're no longer in use, your organization comes in and tries to help rebuild those facilities, those institutions, and get, I guess, families back to some sense of normalcy.
Yep.
How much support from the Iraqi government, as an example, do you get, and how closely do you work with the Iraqi government?
Yeah, so we work closely with all ministries of the Iraqi government. It's absolutely vital to have buy-in from local and national government to ensure that these programs run smoothly, that we have government support in our program. So we have very good relationships with the Ministry of Health, with the local Directorate of Health, Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs. So before we set up any project, our team in Iraq sets up meetings with local ministers, with their staff to lay out the project for them, understand, have them have a good understanding of what the project is. Also because it's really important for sustainability. We want to make sure that when private funding for this project ends or government funding for this project, and that local government or national government have the willingness to take these projects over. And that's something that we have seen with our training centers, that having the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs involved in these centers, providing certificates to participants through our trainers, is really important for the continued sustainability of these centers.
Right. Have there been any obstacles that you ran into on the government side? Say, for instance, some of the programs for a different religious sect or a different ethnic group. Did you find that there were obstacles within the government to supporting some of these different groups?
Yeah, so we do work with different sectors, different within governments. There's always kind of there's going to be some conflicting priorities,
right?
And finding that balance of relationships between governance and governors within the areas is definitely important, and that's what's really great about the AMR model of having an all local team on the ground, is that they're able to use their connections. They're able to understand the cultural sensitivities with working in certain areas with certain ministries. They are part of the community. These are not outsiders that are coming in trying to set up programs. They understand what the need is for those tailored communities.
Right, and if you really localize the efforts, you get certainly the local buy-in from a local government that may not have a sectarian bias to it.
Absolutely.
Okay. What about international support? Like, describe the various international donors that you have.
Yeah, so we work with the U.S. Department of State. Is a very large donor of ours, and has continued to support our programming, particularly through Democracy, Rights, and Labor Bureau. We have worked with the World Health Organization in the past, the World Bank, other international entities. There are the Germans and Dutch are heavily involved in programming within Iraq. I was recently at a USAID conference to address the issue of IDPs not returning to the Nineveh Plain once Mosul was removed from the area. And not only was the U.S. government present, but many countries were at that same conference, hearing ideas from local organizations, understanding what the needs are, understanding what the solutions are. And there's a good amount of international buy-in from foreign governments in the country right now.
So you work with other international institutions in executing programs, or do you kind of coordinate so that their activities go in one area and your activities go another area? How do you do that kind of synchronization?
Yeah, absolutely. Something that definitely is an issue in the development sector is duplication, and making sure that you try to coordinate with all of the international actors or entities to ensure that two organizations aren't doing the exact same thing in parallel, where you really could strengthen that program by coordinating. And that's something that some particular donors will be really good at, introducing one organization to another organization that they're funding and suggesting that you create a partnership. We're part of an international consortium right now with 3 other organizations working on a human rights documentation initiative. And the great thing about that is getting the experience from multiple organizations in one project, and everyone bringing their expertise in. The UN also has cluster meetings that they set up in country, and those cluster meetings will be themed. So one might be on protection, one cluster might be on housing, and organizations that work within those sectors will attend these cluster meetings to understand what programming is going on, what opportunities might be coming up, and how you can better coordinate.
Right. What programs do you think that were tried but really turned out to be ineffective? Were any programs you think not so effective, and you decided to send resources in another area?
I think that it with Iraq in particular, the landscape is constantly changing, and priorities definitely shift quite often. I think that as we focused on health, as we've continued to focus on healthcare and education, those are two really fundamental issues that communities need.
Right.
And something that we've kind of always seen our model with healthcare being kind of the root of a tree. If you don't have a healthy community, you're not going to really be able to do much more within that community. Right. If they're lacking fundamental healthcare. Right. And then education kind of being the trunk of the tree, and being able then to rise to more social issues such as human rights or women's empowerment issues. So focusing on those fundamental issues initially have really continued our programming to be successful. And I think that the mental health care programming is definitely something that continues to need strengthening. Right. That's something that is going to take years and years of resources dedicated to the issue, continued support by international donors, continued buy-in from the government to ensure that Iraq has a comprehensive, strong mental health care support system, just due to the amount of conflict and the amount of trauma that has happened within the country.
Right. Do you think there's been enough international recognition of some of the problems that women face in these conflict zones? I mean, you mentioned the really women being subject to this sexual violence during conflict. Do you think there's international recognition for it, and do you think there's enough enough resources behind those programs?
I think that it is definitely something that could always use more resources to, and a greater amount of attention to. As I mentioned, Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne has been heavily involved in all-party parliamentary groups in the House of Lords, trying to bring light to this issue, has worked with other large international figures that have been also really vocal on this issue, such as Angelina Jolie, Amal Clooney, because it definitely needs to be in the public narrative a lot more. I think that it tends to constantly be seen as kind of a part of war, and I don't think that we should continue just having that be part of the narrative. Right. That it's just something that happens in conflict. It definitely demands greater resources to try and understand how to avoid the issue in future conflicts, not just within the MENA region, but in all conflicts.
Right. What programs did you find really were ineffective, and why were they ineffective?
Programs that have that start off with a basis of not understanding local context will never succeed. Okay. Programs that do not have planning from the local level, or programs that you might take from a model from one area and just plop it down in another area. Okay. Those programs will not be successful without understanding the intricacies of a particular community. Right. For example, we tried to start training centers for men and women in various governance in Iraq. We kind of across the board made them mixed gendered issues. Well, initially we had centers that were aimed for vocational skills training for women. A donor of ours asked us to make them all mixed gender. Our team on the ground was a bit hesitant about doing that, understanding the cultural sensitivities that might come into play. But we went ahead and made the centers mixed gender. Come the time of the opening of the centers, recruiting individuals in certain areas that were a bit more conservative, women would not sign up for the centers. This was an issue that we knew. We saw it coming. We went ahead and went with the mixed gender centers anyway, and sure enough, community leaders had an issue with it, local families had an issue with it, and the women wouldn't come to the centers if there were men present. So what we had to do is then create essentially separate centers that uses more resources, uses more time, delays the project, where something we could have, we kind of saw coming.
Right.
We didn't have to, waste those resources down the line.
Right.
When you don't listen to local expertise,
Right.
or if you don't, push back on your donors sometimes and let them know
Right.
what the situation is on the ground,
Right.
you're going to wind up wasting
Right.
their resources.
Right, right. So do you think that the conflict in the Middle Eastern region is an opportunity to advance women's empowerment and women's rights? Or do you think that it's just a challenge and that the culture may not change?
I absolutely think there's an opportunity. We have, time and time again, seen the data and statistics that economies are stronger when there is female participation. Governments are stronger when there is female participation on the national level, getting more women into politics, getting more women, adding into the economy. When you have an economy that can have 50% more participation in it, it's going to be stronger. In coming out of situations of conflict are absolutely an opportunity to push the boundaries on some of these issues. When you're trying to rebuild economies within communities, we need to make sure that we are including women, we are including young girls in these programs to ensure that the economy is functioning to its full capacity. Out of a terrible situation such as conflict within a community, there is absolutely great opportunity for that.
Okay. What about jobs? So as you train individuals in some new vocation, do you find that there are jobs for them then to move into, not just starting their own business, but actually, jobs from the government or from other industries that they can actually move into?
Yeah, so what we have done on a previous project and a current skills training project that we've done is to conduct a market analysis, go into the areas that we're going to be starting these training centers and identify the skills gaps
Right.
that are within these markets. And that might look different from Baghdad to Basra.
Right.
Those are two completely different markets, and we need to understand where the skills gaps are.
Right.
And then from that, identify what vocational skills courses will offer. And again, that might be different for men, and that might be different for women. And I think that's a really important part of understanding what is needed, and also making sure that you are putting a supply into the market that is going to be needed.
Right.
And ensuring that you're not creating a bunch of competition, in one community by training a bunch of individuals on the same skill.
Right.
And I think that that's definitely going to be important to build those economies.
Right. How would you say that that the development challenges in Iraq translate to other countries? It certainly makes sense that it would translate to Syria since it's a conflict zone. Do those same approaches translate to, say, Egypt, as an example?
So I think that the conflict issues within the region between Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, are it really it goes back to what the economies and the skills and the makeup are within the countries. So Iraq is a country that has suffered a great amount of sectarian violence over the past few decades. And the solutions for creating a strong economy within communities that have varying sectarian issues is definitely going to look different than creating economic opportunities for farmers in Egypt, or decreasing violence within the Sinai in Egypt, versus having tribal relationships better in the south of Iraq. Iraq is a country that throughout history has been had really high levels of education, and understanding what the cultural, the historic and cultural background of the country is
Right.
important to understand how to move forward within those countries.
Okay, let's talk about education. Where do you get your curriculum for the education support? And does the government, whether it's a province or the national government, do they pick up the responsibility for education at some point after you guys are finished?
Yeah, so for a lot of our education programs, our skills training programs, the curriculum will come from the Ministry of Education or the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs if it's more vocational.
Okay.
And the reason for that is participants that will take an English course that is under the Ministry of Education curriculum will be able to get a Ministry of Education certificate, and then that will allow them to advance to the next grade level if they want to return to the formal education system. For Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs certificate, that is something that will be recognized across sectors. That's an official ministry certificate. So that's why it's important for us to coordinate with the government ministries on these curricula to ensure that they're in line with government curricula, and that will also have the ministries pick up these classes or be more motivated to continue training centers if we're already on their curricula. But that's not to say that we should not be suggesting changes to certain curriculum or trying to make improvements to certain curriculum, and that's something that our team continues to do, looking at government curricula and understanding how we can include stronger human rights issues, stronger health issues, ideas of gender equality, and how do we then present those to the government and have them understand that this is important to put into their official curriculum. And that's something that our team continues to do while working with government ministries.
Right. What about areas where, say, the elementary schools have basically stopped because of the conflict? Do you then have elementary schools, that you run until the government can come and then open the regular schools back up, and then the children go back into the regular schools? How temporary are your educational efforts for children?
Yeah, so in the IDP camps in the north, our work is in a lot of the community centers will hold education classes, or we'll try to hold remedial education so that students stay as up to date as they possibly can on their schooling, so that they can return to the formal sector. Right now we don't have any temporary school prefabs or buildings like that. It's mostly working within local communities to make sure that teachers are employed, that there is the availability of classrooms for students. A lot of the schools will work on various shifts, so they'll cut down the school time. And some kids will go in from 8 a.m. to 1, and then there'll be a 1 to 4 o'clock block. Just because so many schools were being used as were destroyed or being used as for other uses. It definitely limited the amount of schools that were available.
Okay, let's talk about refugees. How big of a problem is the internationally displaced persons in Iraq?
Yeah, so there are hundreds of thousands of individuals displaced throughout Iraq. You also had Syrian refugees that were fleeing Syria, coming into Iraq, and that placed a massive burden on the Iraqi government. Particularly in the Kurdish regions, as you saw a lot of individuals fleeing Mosul and the Nineveh plains from ISIS into the Kurdish region. It's where many of the IDP camps were set up in the north, and with low oil prices, with an economy that was already struggling to gain income, the Kurdish region really was put in a particularly difficult situation to take on the amount of IDPs that they did. IDPs did go down to Baghdad, to Basra, to some of the southern governance as well. But we really did see a high concentration of displaced in the north, again, putting a major stress on the Directorate of Health, Directorate of Educations in the north.
What effect does the conflict have in neighboring countries? Specifically with refugees, but what other spillover is there from, these conflicts to the countries that aren't participating in the war.
Absolutely, and with the destabilizing nature of conflict, then you have neighboring countries that try to take advantage of the conflict situation. So right now in Iraq we have the Iranian influence on one side and the Saudi influence on the other side, and having that conflict in place allowed that vacuum to exist, where foreign governments could try and place pressure, influence on politics within these areas, continuing sectarian tensions and conflict, and putting a country in a place that they are not only fighting people from within their borders, but trying to starve off foreign influence.
Right. So really the individuals in these communities are vulnerable not just to the local violence, but to nation states that may want to participate in and influence the outcome too, and then they become subject to the pressures and some of the problems that the international, say, players in the conflict put on them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not just the physical conflict or violence that's happening within their communities, but it's absolutely the political, and they are victims to the political conflict that arises when you have a situation like Iraq or like Syria, where everyday citizens are affected by the actions of foreign nationals influencing politics within their country.
So how does the large influx of refugees into a community, how does that disrupt a community that's not maybe destroyed by the conflict, but then has a lot of these people come into it now, and how disruptive is that to those communities that they go to?
Yeah, absolutely. So when you have a large amount of refugees coming into a host community, or displaced individuals coming into a host community, it definitely creates tension. It creates tension between communities that might not have really interacted much before. Different nationalities, ethnicities, sects of religions are now all of a sudden placed into one bubble. And something that we've always tried to address in our programming is social cohesion, community cohesion. So how within a training center, do we bring someone who might be a Shebek IDP that's now living in a Shia Arab community, and is that through recreational activities, setting up a soccer field, within a center, having handicraft classes where people can sit around and learn to knit, kind of do like a knitting circle, and understand their new neighbors a little bit better. Something that we've heard from some of our human rights documenters is that within communities in the South, host communities were extremely hesitant to welcome some IDPs, right? And by holding kind of town hall like meetings, you get them to interact with each other better, to hold a picnic or a festival. You are then having kids from one community play with kids from another, and really helps to ease that transition a little bit more.
Right. Do you provide any resources or support to those communities, not just to the camps, but to the communities too, because there's a lot of pressure economically on essential services, these kind of things? Do you provide services to those communities then?
Yeah, so we absolutely always try to make sure that individuals from the host communities are involved in our projects. So, for example, the vocational training centers, we wanted to make sure that there was an equal balance of services offered to host community members and to IDPs. Because we absolutely don't want to come into a community and only offer social services to IDPs and not host communities, because that is now extra individuals on their economy taking services that host communities might not be receiving.
Right. What about crime and, say, terrorist recruiting in some of these IDP camps? Do you face any kind of challenges with crime in these camps?
So what we have heard from several of our human rights documenters is that within the camps there very well may be former ISIS fighters or families of ISIS fighters that have gone into these IDP camps and are essentially pretending to be IDPs or victims of the conflict, victims of the conflict that are living within the camps, and that does create a sense of fear within some of these camps that some individuals might not be free to tell their stories because they're not sure who in these camps might be their neighbors. We have not witnessed any overt acts of violence within the camps due to that issue, but that's definitely something that we have heard as a fear from some individuals in the camps.
So there's still some intimidation, but not necessarily, violence occurring in the camps.
Yeah.
What about refugees that, I guess, or maybe they're IDPs that kind of find themselves, bouncing around and not really finding a place that they can actually stay for a period of time? Do you find that there's a lot of, transitory people that just can't find a good place on a battlefield where they feel secure and safe?
Absolutely, and the issue of return is something that we are seeing more and more of. As ISIS has officially been pushed out of the country of Iraq, many of the IDPs that were living in camps or host communities, had either a hesitation to return home because they didn't know what they might be returning to. Is their home there? Is there school there? Are there neighbors that might have, turned them in or betrayed them in the past? How do you live next to that individual? So that's something that the security issue and the economic issue of liberated areas has definitely been a challenge to get people to return. Others, have been quite satisfied in where they've landed. Maybe they've gotten a job now in their host community, and they don't necessarily want to return. Something that we've seen a lot with younger individuals that might have come from rural areas. They're now living in a city, and they don't necessarily want to go back to rural life. They want to stay where they are, that is definitely causes an issue of demographic change within these communities. It's kind of, I think, over the next couple of years and decade or so, we'll see if a lot of those communities kind of stay where they are or don't return home. We'll definitely see the effects of that demographic change. So
how long does it take to really rebuild one of these communities after it's been destroyed and you want to have a return? How long does it really take to get those communities back up to, I guess, function again?
Yeah, so a lot of the times what we'll try to do is create, a 2, 5, 10-year plan for a lot of these communities.
Okay.
And that's something that MR has previously worked with the Yazidi community on in how to, revitalize the Sinjar area. So what needs to happen within the first year? Rebuilding of schools, rebuilding of medical facilities, and then the 3-year plan of making sure that roads are paved where there can be sufficient amount of trade, or that the economy is up and running and there's investment within a community. And then, where does security play into there? Training of local police forces to, better protect communities. You try and map out kind of where along the timeline each of these issues will fall, and what needs to come first and what then will come after.
Right. Now you mentioned the security aspects, and that seems to be an important portion of the development and the return and some of these liberated areas becoming functional again. How closely do you work with security institutions, whether they're private security companies or government security forces or external peacekeepers? How close are you involved with the security institutions?
The security institutions tend to be quite autonomous, and run through the Ministry of Interior or the Ministry of defense, depending on kind of the level of security it is. With a lot of our programming, if it's State Department funded, there are a lot more regulations that that you would need to go through, such as Lehigh vetting for working with security forces. And that's a really great example of why sometimes it's necessary to work with a different government or donor on one particular project, because they might have a little bit more ability to train security forces, where a purely USG funded program might not lend to that. We've worked in prisons in the past, working with prison guards and prisoners to increase levels of education and kind of social cohesion and religious tolerance within prisons. So we've worked with prison security in the past, but as our current model, we don't necessarily focus on working with security forces. We're much more focused on the community level.
Do you find that some programs in some areas are dependent on functioning security, and that you really can't go into those areas unless you have some kind of security?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's something that was a concern of ours going into areas of Mosul right after ISIS was pushed out, evaluating what the security situation is and whether it's safe for our team to go there and start working. Is it safe for individuals to return home? If we create a program, or if we start a project or a service, one, are there going to be individuals that can benefit from that? And two, is the security situation stable enough for us to sufficiently conduct a project? And that's something that we do before all of our projects are run a risk analysis, understanding what the probability of a risk may be, what the impact might be, and then how you mitigate those. So if it's a medium to high risk, you're definitely going to want to have some kind of plan in place, or a couple of plans to make sure that you mitigate that, or you fix that risk if faced with it.
You have a mix of different programs. Do you find that there's a balance that you have between, say, education and health and really vocational training that specifically focus on material benefits and material growth? Or do you find that some of the tolerance training and the human rights classes really make more progress? Do you find one is better than the other? One material side is better than the psychological or cultural side in education? Or do you see that a balance is really the way to go forward?
I definitely think it really is dependent on what the makeup of the community is that we're looking to work in. But a balance is definitely always going to be, I think will lead to the strongest benefit working in these programs. If you might have a really strong health care program, but if you still have community violence or sectarian violence within a community, that health project might continue to run well and good, but the community is still suffering from sectarian violence. Right. So understanding where to strike that balance is absolutely an important part of planning these projects. Right. And we try to incorporate a lot of these elements into kind of a single project. So whether it be a healthcare project, we will understand how do we build in some kind of economic opportunity aspect to that project. Or if it's a vocational training center, let's make sure to have a psychologist on staff to provide psychosocial support to these individuals, or provide human rights lectures in the actual centers. And that's something that we have had really great success with our training center model, is having all of these different elements within a center, creating a community center that not only provides hard skills training, but provides health lectures, so the community understands how to prevent cholera, or human rights lectures, so they understand the impact of gender-based violence, or how to identify and combat gender-based violence within their community.
What about health issues? You just mentioned it. How are these communities affected by conflict in terms of their health, and are there epidemics like cholera that kind of break out in these communities?
A few years ago, there was a large cholera outbreak in Iraq, and that was due to the conflict, the instability, the lack of resources that were available. We have run a women's health volunteers program for several years now. It's been wildly successful, taking women within the community, providing them training on health issues, and then they go within their community and provide this knowledge to their community members. And that's something that has been a great model because it really raises the platform and the position of these women within their communities to be in a position of knowledge and power, where these women are now looked to as a resource in providing education within their communities and how to prevent cholera or to make sure that the communities are vaccinated against polio.
Right.
And it really helps again kind of raise their status within the community.
Right. And at the same time improve the health of the community.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay. So do you find that these conflicts really break down the family structures of these communities, and they're missing one or two people, families maybe be split up? Is there any way to really recover these communities, or how long does it take? Does it take another generation for these communities to recover in terms of cohesion in the family and then in these communities?
This is something that we deal with on an ongoing basis in conflict. And how do you create some kind of sense of reconciliation, within communities? Communities that or neighborhoods that might have been at odds with each other in conflict, and then you have an IDP crisis, and then they want to return home. How do you create that sense of reconciliation within communities? How do you rebuild those families? And that's something that we, on our human rights documentation initiative, we are working with our consortium of partners on understanding how to implement transitional justice mechanisms within Iraq. The issue is there were issues that have been, there were issues from prior to 2003
Right.
under Saddam that have
Right.
never been addressed.
Right.
There are issues from 2003 to 2014 that have never been addressed by local militias, by the Iraqi government, by coalition forces. So where does one conflict start, and where does
Right.
the effect of one conflict? Where do you pick up on that, and how do you start to address these grievances without going back to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 150 years ago? But I think that as communities do start to rebuild, as economies strengthen, as people have jobs, as people have access to health care, they will turn their attention on how do now we rebuild the social fabric of our communities. It's not a priority when you don't have food, or when you don't have health care,
Right.
or when you don't know where the body of your loved one is, or they might still be missing. So you're not necessarily thinking of how to have this grand reconciliation within your country between communities when you on an individual level need basic services. And we work with the Humanitarian Law Center that documents missing persons within the former Yugoslavia war. And they've been doing this for 20 years, documenting missing persons, and trying to come to piece together the social fabrics of their communities that that underwent egregious human rights abuses. And 20 years on, they're still documenting human rights violations. They're still working to create memorials or museums or dedications to missing persons. So it's definitely something that is a very, very long process. That's something that we say to our human rights documenters time and time again. This is not going to be a short process. we understand that, individuals don't want to talk about transitional justice again when they don't have, food or housing. And that's something that I do believe as these communities, rebuild their basic services and their economies, that they will look to. They will look to understand how they, create a stronger community
Right.
and rebuild that social
Right.
fabric.
So it's part of the recovery process, but it's further down the road. You take care of those immediate needs, security, like you said, food, shelter, and then as the community recovers, it gets to those issues of reconciliation and community structure again.
Absolutely.
But you have it in your planning, in your long range planning. It is something that you do put in your planning and that you do address.
Yeah, absolutely. And regions as, southern Iraq, for example, that haven't seen as much recent conflict, recent as in, the last 5 years.
Right,
Right.
right.
We are able to focus on those social cohesion programs. We had an EU-funded program that was combating religious discrimination, our CRD program, and that worked with Southern tribal leaders and religious leaders on coming together, having dialogue, creating a greater sense of cohesion between their communities to reduce that sectarian violence. So when you're working within a region that has moved past that initial conflict area, and they do have those social services in place, they then can refocus on
Right.
on those social issues.
Right. Human rights. Who cares about human rights in the combat zone? Does the government really care about it? Do the warring factions care about it? Do the communities care about it? Is it only the international donors and relief agencies that care about human rights? Who cares about human rights in the conflict zone?
It's it's quite the loaded question there, and because on the battle zone, unfortunately,
Right.
it is not a concern. It is
Right.
not a priority.
Right.
We see that by the amount of violations that are perpetrated kind of on all sides of the conflict or many conflicts. There are instances that we see of maybe not a direct violation, but the allowance of a violation. Certain militias that didn't do anything to stop something from happening, but didn't have a direct involvement in it, and they might not see that as a human rights violation on their part. They didn't have a direct hand in it, but maybe they stopped a group of people from entering an area that was safe, and then because of that, that group of people underwent a violation.
Right.
And I think on the government side, it is again not a priority for them when they are trying to fend off, or when they're in a current conflict, or they're trying to fend off, an enemy of the state. That being concerned about human rights violations of individual citizens is not always a priority. The international community is focused on it in the sense that a lot of resources are put to understanding what violations have occurred and how to avoid these violations in the future. And I think that's something that we need to continue to put pressure on international donors, on the international community, of understanding what what violations occurred and how do we prevent these violations from happening again. For example, the Yazidi community in Iraq have undergone numerous attempts of genocide and acts of genocide against their people. And a concern for them is, how do we have security? How do we protect our people to ensure that this does not happen again? And thankfully, this has been on the radar of the international community. It has gotten a fair amount of attention in the media, and there are definitely, that's definitely something that needs to keep the momentum behind it, to ensure that these acts of genocide and human rights violations are avoided in the future as best as possible.
Right. So do you see that the governments are not as concerned about the human rights while the conflict is occurring, but then afterwards they're supportive, or do they ever become more concerned during the conflict?
Depending on what government you have in place after a conflict, it will vary. If you have a government in place that has come into an administration or power with the priority of creating some kind of social cohesion or reconciliation within their country, I think it will be a priority of that country, because if they see the value in preventing sectarian violence from continuing in the future, because they've just gone decades of sectarian violence, and to not repeat the issues of the past, they understand that human rights violations need to be addressed. If it is a government that has come into power, just to kind of clamp down on the conflict, kind of be a strong arm in the situation, they might not be as forward thinking. Right. They might look to increase, to better the security situation, get a control over the situation, and not turn to human rights as an issue.
You mentioned genocide. So were there any lessons learned from events in the past, say in Rwanda or Bosnia, or pick other places where genocide has occurred? Were there any lessons learned that were applicable to northern Iraq with the Yazidis? And did the United Nations or other large international organizations, they knew about it, but did they actually help with the protection of those people?
I think that in conflict as it's occurring, you do try and take examples of the past and understand how you can utilize those. When it comes down to airdropping food for Yazidis that are stranded in Sinjar. I mean, it's such you have so many different aspects that you're taking into consideration with when do you go into a certain area, when do you create a no-fly zone, or when do you when are you acting as a foreign entity within a country with your own troops on the ground to prevent a genocide. I mean, we see this with kind of criticism of our action or inaction in Syria. We don't want to be seen as troops on the ground, another Iraq, another invasion. But then what consequences does that happen down the line? I think that in the Yazidi situation, Secretary Kerry previously calling it a genocide against the Yazidis. The Holocaust Museum recognizing it as a genocide. I think those are all really positive steps to take. Raising it to that level, understanding that these instances of genocide do continue to happen. I feel as though a lot of the times we hear genocide and we always think of things of the past, things that happened quite a time ago, and these genocides are still occurring, and keeping it in the conscious of the general population. One of our most successful publicly funded campaigns, meaning $10, $200, $20 donations from the general public, was the Our Escaping Darkness program, which was to provide mental health support to Yazidi women that were kidnapped from ISIS, and that's because that resonated with so many people. It was in the media. We were hearing about what was happening to Yazidis, and these were 15, 16-year-old girls, and Americans across the country felt, I have a 15-year-old girl, I have a 15-year-old daughter. What if that was my daughter? And being able to make that connection is so important to have individuals understand these conflicts. Iraq and the Yazidi community being so far from the American consciousness before this issue, or kind of Iraq being a saturated issue within the American population. Of we've been hearing Iraq for how many years now? We're kind of we're tired of it, and by having again international figures talking about these issues, calling it a genocide, kind of helps bring that back.
So were those international efforts effective at protecting the Yazidis?
I think it depends on who you might ask. A lot of it, kind of was in hindsight, kind of after the fact of we're calling it, what happened was, opposed to what is happening. And I think that it's been slow to understand what to do next or how to resolve the issue in the future. If you, I can't speak on behalf of the Yazidi community, but individuals that we've spoken to from the Yazidi community, a lot of them say that they don't necessarily want to return home unless there's international security, unless there are protections, unless someone ensures their safety, and if not, that they want to be resettled somewhere else. And that is an issue for many in the Yazidi community themselves, because the Sinjar and their area, that's their home, that's their religious ties to the country, and being resettled out of the country, they feel like they're going to lose that identity, and so I think that it's working with these organizations that have these voices, that can stand up and advocate for what they need, is going to be important.
A lot of the international responses were reactive in a lot of ways. Do you think there's more that can be done to prevent those kinds of, crises?
I think understanding what some of the kind of trigger warnings are, moving forward, being able to place certain issues, from past experiences, and understanding what we could have done better. As long as we are always kind of looking in the past to understand what our mistakes might have been, might help us in the future to avoid these issues. But it's so hard to say when it is an active conflict or an active war zone, what we as the U.S. government might be able to do, or what we as the international community or the development sector, what we might be able to do, because there are always so many moving pieces happening so quickly.
Right. It's hard to be I guess, a responder prior to an event. It's hard to there's a lot of resistance to getting involved in a conflict, anticipating problems, because you have to have a really, to be preemptive, you have to have a really good reason to invade, to prevent a genocide. If you really know one's occurring or going to occur, it's hard to tell.
Absolutely.
What about, this is important for the Yazidis, I guess, but let's talk about religious protections then, and religious programs, because a lot of these issues, whether it's ethnic or religious or gender, a lot of times they overlap. So do you have programs that look at the religious tolerance and religious persecution in these conflict zones?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned our European Union funded Combating Religious Discrimination program, and that looked at understanding or bringing together different actors and voices within religious communities, to talk about their differences, to talk about solutions on how to mitigate conflict, and then have those religious leaders or communities go back to their constituents, go back to their congregations, and talk about their dialogue, or talk about their experiences working with other communities to try and dispel some stereotypes one community might have about another. We have had like media campaigns to try and prevent gender-based violence, bringing in religious leaders into a an anti-gender-based violence programming to put that aspect of it in context. So as a religious leader, to talk about ensuring that it's might not it's not okay to take a female to take the life of a female family member because she wanted to marry someone that you did not approve of, or having a religious leader condemn the killings of young men that were perceived to be homosexual, just because they were perceived to be homosexual, right? And having a religious leader say, you as an individual, you as a human being, you don't have the right to take the life of someone else just because you perceive that individual to be, against God, right? You don't have that right. And having religious leaders, even though it seems like such a small, gesture to say, don't kill this individual, in that, being put in the context of religion or that constituency's beliefs is going to be really important. And kind of creating radio show campaigns, like magazine campaigns, is something that we've done to try and raise awareness about gender-based violence within communities, whether it be religious-based, social-based, and to make sure that young men and boys, or young men, have an understanding of what gender-based violence is and how to identify it and how to prevent it, and then also having women and young girls understand their rights, and giving them resources or legal protection if they needed to get out of a abusive situation. But again, working with getting the buy-in of community members or religious leaders is definitely going to be important when dealing with these social issues, because many times it is community and religious leaders that are the go-to. They're the ones that are essentially creating rule of law opposed to formal rule of law. So if you want these projects, or you want a certain issue to be successful, you do need to engage religious and community leaders to get their buy-in.
Right. So we know that there's, I guess, sectarian conflict between the Shia and the Sunni in many of these areas, and then we see, say, the Yazidis kind of being persecuted. We've seen a lot of Christians and Jews in those areas also be persecuted. What programs do you have for some of these religious minorities in these countries?
Our combating religious discrimination also included, minority groups, to understand these differences. Again, dispel stereotypes or preconceived notions that some communities might have about others. We, in all of our programming, strive to be inclusive of minorities, because that goes back to the idea of always trying to have some kind of social cohesion element to our projects. If it's a training center, or if it's a primary healthcare center, having interactions between a Christian and an Arab Sunni is going to be really important to build a greater sense of trust between these communities, and so that's something that we try to involve in all of our planning for projects, is to make sure that these communities are involved.
Do you find that, say in some of the IDP camps, that the individuals in these camps want to be, segregated by their ethnicity or by their sect or religious preference or by their gender? Or do you find that they are okay with these, I guess, greater cohesive units?
I think that humans, as humans, we tend to kind of gravitate towards those that we share similar cultural
Right.
practices with and backgrounds with, and I think that it is going to be a natural effect, to kind of come together, especially in a time of conflict and in a time of trauma. You're going to want to feel as though you have a social safety net, and that's definitely something that you see, with IDPs or refugees. But with that said, I do think that there is a want and an encouragement to have these social cohesion projects, have these religious tolerance projects, because on the community level, they do want to make sure that similar conflict does not happen again,
Right.
and that they need a greater sense of trust within their community. So I definitely think it is something that is wanted and needed, and something that we've seen a great amount of drive behind.
Right. So the conflicts put a lot of pressure on, say, social unity and national unity and identity, where they feel like they have an affinity to someone who's different from them. So a lot of your projects are trying to build that national identity, that unification back. How difficult is it to kind of resolve those cross-group, I guess, problems? And do you see that they can get a similar identity, a unified identity back?
I think that as long, again, going to having local buy-in, engaging religious leaders and community leaders in the process is going to be vital in this. And if they have the want and if they have the drive to participate in these issues, they understand the benefit of avoiding future sectarian violence, it definitely will trickle down to the communities. And with then kind of beyond that, the local government or national government will also see the motivation behind having these social cohesion projects succeed.
Okay. And so you think it's possible to build back a national identity, a cohesive identity, not just a very narrow identity?
I do think it's possible, and I think that is ideal in my opinion, and I think that we are seeing that we saw that in the past election that happened last month, was the campaigning behind a national identity, a Iraqi identity. That wasn't necessarily how the elections wound up turning out, majority-wise, but you definitely saw a body campaigning in Kurdistan, opening campaign offices in the north and getting votes from Kurds, to his party, which is not something that has happened before.
Right.
So there are definitely signs of that. That want to be there of creating a national identity and not just Sunni, Shia,
Right.
Christian, Yazidi, Shebek.
Okay. What are some of the lessons learned that you have, I guess, seen over time in say development or in education or anything?
One of the most important things that I've learned working in this sector is the sheer importance of local input and local planning. I think sometimes in the development sector we tend to get caught up with putting in a really nice proposal or pitching a really great project to a donor because we think that it's going to sound really great, and then it comes down to the implementation of that project, and half of it is not doable, right?
Right.
And then that's resources and time, wasted of the donor and beneficiaries that might not be now be able to benefit. So the importance of local input on planning of these projects, building up local organizations to advocate for themselves, to work with local civil society to understand what they can do to advocate for funding to international donors, because projects that are planned by the community and from the community are going to be the most successful. If you come in as a large organization with no ties to the community, you are going to be seen as an outsider. You are going to face a lot more resistance within the community than if you are from the community and you have ties to that community. So local buy-in and local input in the planning phase is definitely important. And then large organizations such as UN entities or large international NGOs to make sure that they're supporting smaller organizations, that you are getting the most out of your resources, because being able to fund smaller, more localized organizations, you're going to do things cheaper and more effectively.
Right.
If these large contracts are always going to large institutions that have 4 degrees of separation until the actual project, that's a lot of resources that are not going to the actual communities.
Right. Anything else that you want to talk about that we didn't cover?
I think we covered a good amount.
Yeah, I think we did too. I think we
yeah.
got a really good, a lot of good answers from you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for
Absolutely.
joining us.
Yeah.
Really appreciate your insight, and we appreciate the work that you're doing in Iraq to help a lot of the people there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for having me.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Appreciate it.
All right.
Yeah.